The ancient stone walls of Chopa's castle still seem to whisper with the echoes of screams that once rang out over 400 years ago. Even now, in the stillness of winter nights, those echoes seem to rebound off the cold granite, as if time itself never quite moved on. If you find yourself standing in the remains of the tower where she was entombed alive, you might swear you can still smell it, the sharp metallic scent of iron, laced with the sickly sweetness of decay that once clung to every inch of these cursed halls. The liquid is darker, thicker, and sends up wisps of steam in the icy air of the dungeon. Her skin, pale and creased with the weight of age, despite all her desperate efforts to defy it, shines blood-red in the flicker of candlelight. It's the year 1610. In the deepest, darkest part of this fortress, a noblewoman sits in a bath, but not one filled with water. She glides her hands through the warmth of the bath, convinced with every part of her soul that this gruesome ritual will restore her youth, her beauty, her control. But the girl whose life now fills that grotesque tub will never open her eyes again. She was barely 16. A servant? Her only crime? Tugging too hard while brushing her mistress's hair. Her family tree was warped by centuries of inbreeding, concentrating not only power and privilege, but also the slow creep of madness. Her uncle Stephen was infamous for his explosive temper and his sadistic methods of punishing prisoners. And feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to know where you're listening from. She taught young Elizabeth the use of herbs and potions, rituals that teetered between healing and witchcraft. Picture the child Elizabeth, porcelain-skinned, dark eyes alert, and absorbing every detail, gliding through the shadowed halls of her family's vast estate. Not merely the power to give life, but the far deeper thrill of taking it away. Slowly, deliberately, watching as the light drained from someone's eyes. A peasant, accused of stealing grain, was dragged before her father. The punishment wasn't swift. It was calculated, cold. The man was stripped, tied down, and left to freeze to death in the courtyard as the family looked on from the warmth of their upper chambers. It is amazing how we can connect across time and space through our shared curiosity for the past. But while her public lessons showcased grace and intellect, the teachings behind closed doors were far more disturbing. And for that, she paid with her life. She didn't flinch as the man's skin turned blue, then purple, then black. Not even when his fingers began to snap off, brittle from frostbite. This is the tale of Elizabeth By, his so-called blood countess. A woman whose name became a byword for cruelty so horrific that even the officials assigned to investigate her were haunted by what they uncovered. The marriage, like most noble unions, was arranged. But Ferenc did not resist Elizabeth's growing fascination with cruelty. On the contrary, he may well have been her first true mentor in the art of causing pain. But to understand the monster, we must first understand the world that shaped her and the woman she once was. Before we descend further into this dark and forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you find value in exploring the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Elizabeth By was born in 1560 into one of Hungary's most powerful and feared noble families. In a world where power was everything, and where the lives of peasants were worth almost nothing, the By name carried enormous weight throughout Eastern Europe. They were said to be dragon slayers, vampire hunters, and master manipulators who shaped the politics of their time for generations. But the legacy of Elizabeth's noble bloodline came with a hidden cost, one that would only become truly clear as she grew older. Her aunt, Clara, was rumored to walk paths darker still said to be a practitioner of forbidden arts. Her education was befitting her station. She was fluent in 4 languages, well-versed in philosophy, and trained to move and speak like someone destined to rule. At the age of 11, she witnessed her first execution. Elizabeth stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass, and watched. Years later, She would tell her servants that this was the moment she understood what true power meant. At 15, Elizabeth was wed to Ferenc Nadasti, a decorated military commander known throughout Hungary as the Black Knight. Ferenc Nadasti spent much of his life on the battlefield, fighting relentless wars against the Ottoman Empire. These brutal campaigns were seen as vital to Hungary's survival, and they consumed most of his time. There, the couple experimented on servants who had committed even the smallest of offenses. Inflicting pain ignited something in her that nothing else ever had. Not rare wines, not silks from the East, not even the tangled political games that entertained most nobles of her rank. In these early years of marriage, the killings were sparse and carefully concealed. Under Ferenc's influence, Elizabeth began mastering tools of pain-hot irons, sharp needles, and fine blades. A young maid was helping Elizabeth dress when she tugged too hard on the Countess's hair, snagging it in a brooch. The pain sparked fury. She discovered just how much torment the human body could endure, and how easily the mind could shatter long before the body gave in. Blood sprayed across Elizabeth's hand. As she reached to wipe it away, she noticed something that, real or imagined, would forever alter the course of her life. More youthful, as if the years had lifted, just slightly, from that one spot. But when he returned home, he brought back more than just tales of war. He carried with him dark lessons in torture and interrogation, learned from both foes and allies. And from that moment forward, that belief would drive her to atrocities so brutal, so grotesque, that history would struggle to reckon with them. These signs of aging disturbed her deeply. And more than power, more than legacy, she now craved one thing above all: to reverse time. Always framed as punishment for some petty mistake, a dirty hem, a missed curtsy, a look held too long. She collected the blood in ornate silver bowls and smeared it gently across her cheeks like rouge. Then she would sit for hours, inspecting her reflection under candlelight, hunting for any hint of rejuvenation. Her victims were stripped, bound, and bled slowly, deliberately over hours, sometimes days. Basins were placed beneath them to collect the blood, which she believed became more powerful the longer the girl endured pain and fear. At the center of this inner circle was Countess, an aging woman whispered to be a witch. She acted as Elizabeth's personal advisor in all matters occult, blending superstition with cruelty to create elaborate rites of pain and purification. At first, she killed perhaps once every few months, selecting only the youngest, prettiest servant girls, believing that their youth could be absorbed into her through their blood. If there was a honeymoon between Ferenc and Elizabeth, it played out not in candlelit chambers, but in the dungeons beneath their castle. But more than skill, Elizabeth discovered something far more dangerous: pleasure. And then whole basins, which meant that her victims could no longer survive. A servant girl who broke a prized vase might vanish overnight, her death disguised as an abrupt departure. A stable boy who showed disrespect could be found lifeless in his stall, allegedly trampled by a horse, though his injuries would tell a much darker story to anyone who dared look closely. In 1604, Ferenc died officially from illness, but whispers lingered. Some said even the infamous Black Knight had grown uneasy with his wife's escalating brutality. The rituals took place in the castle's subterranean rooms, where the thick stone walls and layers of tapestries muffled every scream. His death left Elizabeth in possession of enormous wealth, vast landholdings, and most significantly absolute control over the people who lived under her rule. She was 44 now, and for the first time, lines had begun to appear on her once flawless skin. The first time she killed for blood, not out of rage or punishment, but for its imagined restorative power. It was almost accidental. What happened next would mark a turning point in Elizabeth's descent and the beginning of the legend that would haunt her name for centuries. Elizabeth turned in a flash and struck the girl across the face with such force that the gemstone on her ring tore open the servant's cheek. The patch of skin where the blood had touched appeared smoother. Whether it was an illusion or not was irrelevant. Elizabeth believed it entirely. She began with small tests, a needle prick, a shallow cut, but as time passed, so did her patients. Elizabeth became convinced that for the blood to work, it had to be warm, freshly spilled. Drops were no longer enough. She needed pints. The transformation from cruel noblewoman to something far darker was gradual, but unstoppable. She began performing strange rites around these killings, ceremonies laced with the old superstitions and folk magic passed down by her aunt. There, in the hidden chambers of Lactus Castle, Elizabeth orchestrated scenes of unspeakable horror. And she did not work alone. As her obsession deepened, Elizabeth drew close a handful of trusted followers, accomplices, who either shared her depraved desires or were too afraid to defy her. Among Elizabeth's most loyal aides were 4 individuals who formed the core of her deadly operation. Dosha Santis, the aging witch who guided her rituals. Janos Uri, a dwarf who acted both as her bodyguard and her executioner. Ilona Yor, a quiet, calculating servant who helped lure victims. And Catalin Betke, a washerwoman tasked with disposing of the remains. Together, they built a horrifying routine, a machinery of murder that ran with chilling efficiency. She would then bathe in it, sometimes for hours, convinced that this crimson immersion could halt the march of time. Young girls were selected from among the castle as servants, or enticed from nearby villages with false promises of work, safety, and food. The targets were always the same: adolescent girls, healthy and beautiful, chosen as if their vitality alone could somehow be harvested. Others had red-hot irons pressed against their skin, or fine needles forced beneath their fingernails. The most valued victims were those cut with surgical precision, their wounds designed not to kill instantly, but to drain blood as slowly and cleanly as possible. In a world where peasants were seen as disposable and girls disappeared often, their absence raised little alarm. Those who asked questions were silenced, dismissed, or paid off. Many believed the girls had simply run off in search of better lives. The killings varied depending on Elizabeth's mood or her belief in what the blood demanded. Killings occurred weekly, sometimes even more frequently. Elizabeth had convinced herself that the blood of peasant girls had grown too weak, too common. Their lineage, she believed, lacked the strength needed to fuel her transformation. Unlike the peasants, these girls had families who wielded influence. Families who noticed when letters stopped arriving. Families who demanded answers. But when Anna failed to return home after the promised term, her parents came in person to Countess Castle. If she was to reverse time, she needed pure blood-noble blood. She even promised to launch a search. Soon after her arrival, Anna was subjected to the same horrors that had claimed dozens before her. The illusion began to crack. Her screams were muffled by the castle's thick walls. Her blood was harvested, her body hidden. Young women who went to Elizabeth Bailly's castle simply vanished. The crown owed them a great deal of money, and Elizabeth's unchecked power had long been a thorn in the monarchy's side. A scandal, even a shadow of one, would be more than enough. Invitations to study under the infamous Countess were declined. Families who had already sent daughters insisted on constant letters and scheduled visits, not of God or justice or retribution, but of aging. Some girls were beaten with clubs until their bones shattered. The legendary beauty of Hungary now stared back at her with thinning skin, sunken eyes, and the inevitable decay of time. Because in her mind, death had become the price of youth, and she would pay it in blood, again and again. It haunted her more than any ghost could, but the air never truly cleared. The walls held the truth like a tomb. Elizabeth's preferred method was gruesomely ritualistic. The girls were suspended from the ceiling by their wrists, their bodies sliced open in careful stages as their blood poured steadily into a stone basin or bath below. Others were tossed into the river under the cover of darkness. Some were fed to the hounds, and others were simply dragged into the forest and left for scavengers to erase. The castle itself became a slaughterhouse hidden in plain sight. Bodies were disposed of in multiple ways. Some were buried in shallow graves around the grounds. The stench of death seeped into the lower chambers, masked by the constant burning of incense, dried herbs, and crushed petals. What is perhaps most disturbing is how long this went unnoticed. For nearly 6 years, Elizabeth's killing spree continued without interruption from any authority. By 1609, Elizabeth Bathory, now nearly 50, was a woman consumed by terror. Despite all her rituals, bloodbaths, and incantations, the mirror no longer flattered her, and so she doubled down, pushed harder, dug deeper into cruelty. What had once been isolated acts of cruelty, spaced out over months, soon became routine. This escalation would be her undoing. Blinded by obsession, Elizabeth began targeting girls from lesser noble families, inviting them to her estate under the guise of finishing their education or learning to manage a noble household. Her first noble victim was Anna, a distant relative, a bright, gentle 16-year-old sent to refine her courtly manners. To cover her tracks, Elizabeth forged letters in Anna's handwriting, claiming the girl was happy and excelling in her studies. Elizabeth welcomed them with grace and feigned concern, offering elaborate tales. Perhaps Anna had fallen in love and eloped with a local boy. But Anna's mother noticed something deeply disturbing. Elizabeth was wearing a necklace, an heirloom that had belonged to Anna, passed down through generations of their family. Whispers spread quickly through the courts and halls of Eastern Europe. Pressure mounted. The investigation that would finally unravel the nightmare began almost by coincidence. At the time, King Matthias II of Hungary had been seeking a means to seize the Bailly family as immense holdings. And now, whispers had turned into rumors, and rumors into allegations. It was only a matter of time before the truth came bleeding out. When reports of missing noble girls began reaching the royal court, the king saw a rare political opportunity. He appointed György Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, and ironically, a relative of Elizabeth's late husband, to lead the investigation. He gathered physical evidence and tracked the web of disappearances. The investigation stretched on for months. Meanwhile, unaware or unconcerned, Elizabeth continued her rituals of blood and death, as if nothing had changed. Thurzo was known for his diligence and discretion. He understood that accusing someone of Elizabeth's rank required more than rumor. It demanded irrefutable proof. He began his inquiry with quiet determination. Families of the missing were interviewed, their testimonies carefully recorded. By the end of 1610, Thurzo had amassed damning evidence. Dozens of witness accounts from survivors, escaped servants, grieving relatives, and even corrupt officials who admitted to taking bribes to remain silent. A stench so heavy, so unmistakably rotten, struck them like a wall. It was the foul air of death, sweet, sour, and suffocating. Several soldiers turned pale and rushed back outside to retch. But Thurzo pushed them forward, deeper into the castle's darkness, following the trail of rot and silence. But what could be seen, what remained, was undeniable. Bits of flesh floated on the surface. Strands of hair clung to the sides. The liquid was still warm. Nearby, Elizabeth herself stood motionless, drenched in blood from head to toe. None of it appeared to be hers. Chemical testing on the remains suggested they had been kept alive for days, perhaps even weeks, enduring unspeakable suffering before death finally came. A portrait emerged so gruesome that even experienced magistrates found it difficult to comprehend. King Matthias II, wary of destabilizing the aristocracy or inviting future challenges to noble privilege, avoided a public trial that might tarnish the ruling class. In another chamber, they found severed limbs and dismembered torsos, arranged in grotesque patterns that hinted at some dark ritual purpose. Based on these statements, it was believed Elizabeth had tortured and killed anywhere from 80 to as many as 650 young women. And Caterina Benica were put on trial in early 1611. The proceedings drew widespread attention across Europe. Mist still clung to the cold earth, curling around the castle's weathered stones. Survivors, former staff, and local villagers took the stand one after another, painting a portrait of cruelty so vast and calculated that even hardened judges struggled to comprehend the scale. Thurzo had chosen the hour carefully, early enough to prevent anyone from hiding or destroying evidence, but late enough that the daylight would reveal everything. In chilling detail, it chronicled her descent into madness, her beliefs about the life-giving power of blood, her methods for harvesting it, and the ritualistic practices she followed. Some pages were so grotesque that royal officials later sealed them permanently from public view. The true number would never be confirmed. Many of her victims had been poor peasants, their disappearances unrecorded, their lives lost to history. Blood-soaked instruments of torture, rooms steeped in the stench of decay, human bones and remains hidden beneath the stone floors and scattered across the castle grounds. What they discovered inside would stay with them forever. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Seageat Castle with a royal warrant and a detachment of soldiers. The raid began at first light. The first warning came as soon as they stepped into the main hall. In the castle's lower chambers, the investigators encountered horrors that defied imagination. One room held the lifeless bodies of two young women, their blood still warm evidence that they had been killed only hours earlier. But it was within Elizabeth's private quarters that they uncovered the most chilling sight of all. At the center of her chamber stood a large silver tub filled with what could only be described as human blood. The investigators also uncovered a personal journal written in Elizabeth's own hand. Among the most damning discoveries were the decomposing bodies of several missing noble daughters. Each showed signs of prolonged agony. And yet, Elizabeth Bathory, Countess of Seageat, was never formally tried. As a high-ranking noblewoman, she fell outside the jurisdiction of Hungary's standard courts. Instead, Elizabeth was confined to her own castle place under permanent house arrest. Her four closest accomplices, however, were not granted the same leniency. Countess, Ilona Jo, Janos Javari. The prosecution laid out an overwhelming body of evidence, revealing a coordinated and prolonged campaign of murder. Former servants testified to being forced to witness the torture and murder of their fellow workers. Local peasants recounted grisly discoveries, body parts scattered in the woods near the castle. Even some officials confessed to accepting bribes in exchange for turning a blind eye to the growing number of missing women. The physical evidence only deepened the horror. Investigators had uncovered ledgers meticulously documenting each death, complete with hand-drawn diagrams of torture devices and notes evaluating which methods yielded the most blood. They found rooms engineered for slaughter chambers, fitted with drainage systems to collect blood and thick stone walls, designed to muffle the screams of the dying. But the most damning evidence came from the accomplices themselves. But witnesses insisted she had not only participated willingly, but had taken an active role suggesting torture techniques and conducting many of the murders herself. Yet other witnesses described his enthusiasm for the violence, noting that he often volunteered for the most gruesome tasks. Public opinion swiftly turned against the defendants. The sheer volume of evidence, combined with the appalling nature of the crimes, left the court no room for mercy. Facing the inevitability of execution, they began to betray one another, each attempting to downplay their involvement while shifting the blame onto the others. Their confessions peeled back the curtain on what had become a fully mechanized system of death. Countess, the elderly woman who had served as Elizabeth's chief confidant and advisor, claimed she was merely obeying orders. King Matthias II and his advisors were trapped in a political dilemma. Executing a countess could shatter the precedent of aristocratic immunity. Letting her walk free could incite public rebellion. Countess and Janos Javeri were executed brutally, while Ilona Jo and Katerina Benica, though complicit, received slightly more lenient but still fatal sentences. A narrow slit allowed food and water to be passed through. She would live out her final days in silence and solitude, entombed within the walls of the castle that had once been her domain of horror. The doorways were bricked shut, leaving only small openings through which food could be delivered and waste removed. The windows were barred and sealed, cutting off all view of the world she had once ruled over with fear. Janos Javeri, the dwarf who had acted as both bodyguard and executioner, admitted to killing victims with his own hands, though he insisted he acted under duress. She described them in unsettling detail, their injuries, their final screams, their accusing eyes, all to anyone willing to listen. Most were not. Forced to witness her own decay, year by year, without a single admirer left to see her face. As time dragged on, she became not only physically confined, but mentally adrift lost in a world of delusions and memories that grew harder to distinguish from the real. Her speech would shift between pleading and prophecy, sorrow and song. Day after day, she studied her face, transfixed by the very wrinkles and sagging skin she had once killed to avoid. And to watch alone, and in silence as time slowly claimed the face she had once believed could defy it. She had convinced herself that her noble birth would shield her from any lasting punishment. The reality that she would spend the rest of her life entombed and forgotten came as a shock she never fully accepted. The trial dragged on for months, gripping the nation and fueling outrage across Europe. From the moment the last brick was laid, Elizabeth Bathory would never again see daylight, speak to another soul, or touch another hand, save for the brief, silent presence of her guards. The sealing of her chambers took place in late 1611, roughly a year after her arrest. All four were found guilty and sentenced to death. Each met a different end, their executions tailored to their degree of involvement. And yet, Elizabeth Bathory remained untouched by formal justice. But time wore her defiance down. As the seasons passed, Elizabeth began to unravel. The guards reported hearing her speak for hours to unseen companions, sometimes whispering spells and chants, other times shouting in rage or terror at invisible figures only she could see. Though technically under investigation, her noble rank shielded her from the gallows. In the end, they devised a grim compromise. Elizabeth would be imprisoned within her own fortress, sealed away in a small suite of rooms, with the doors and windows bricked shut. She was fed through a narrow slot in the wall, her only remaining link to the world beyond. She was confined to 3 rooms high in the tower of Lactis Castle, a small bedroom, a sitting room, and a private chapel. Contemporary accounts describe Elizabeth's response to her imprisonment as a blend of disbelief and seething fury. In the early months, she vacillated between pleading with her guards for release and threatening them with vengeance once she was inevitably freed. She often claimed the ghosts of her victims had returned to haunt her. The irony was bitter and perfect. The woman who had drained the lives of countless girls in a desperate bid to stay young and beautiful was now imprisoned in solitude. Elizabeth Bathory remained locked in those stone chambers for nearly 4 years, from 1611 until her death in 1614. The guards, when delivering meals, noted that she often failed to recognize them. Sometimes she greeted them as if they were long-dead servants or long-lost relatives. She spent hours staring into a small hand mirror, one of the few personal items she was permitted to keep. It was the final fitting punishment, to be forgotten by the world, surrounded only by the echoes of her own crimes. Her physical health declined swiftly under the harsh conditions of her confinement. Deprived of sunlight, exercise, and proper nourishment, her once lavish lifestyle gave way to a slow bodily collapse. The woman who had once lived amid screams now heard only footsteps and echoes. The weight of isolation crushed what remained of her former self. The opulent beauty she had been known for vanished entirely, replaced by the gaunt, weathered features of someone consumed by despair. She was 54 years old. By all appearances, she had died quietly in her sleep, an end far gentler than any she had offered her victims. The official report listed the cause of death as natural, though some at the time whispered rumors of suicide. Yet even today, visitors to the site report hearing strange sounds and witnessing unexplained phenomena echoing through the decaying halls. Others accused her of summoning demons, of practicing vast and terrible rituals of black magic. Behind the myth was a noblewoman likely suffering from profound mental illness, consumed by vanity and a brutal desire for control. While the legend grew increasingly fantastical, modern historians have tried to peel back the layers of fiction to uncover the truth beneath. The myth of Elizabeth Bathory spread across Europe, taking root in folklore and inspiring countless books, stage plays, and eventually films. Her story is not just a tale of individual madness. It is a warning about unchecked power, the human capacity for cruelty, and how easily evil can hide behind titles, wealth, and social privilege. She became the archetype of the seductive female vampire, a beautiful but monstrous figure who drank the blood of the innocent to retain her youth. Elizabeth's crimes were not committed in a vacuum. They were shaped by a society that valued noble blood above human life, and by a feudal system that allowed aristocrats near absolute authority over those beneath them. Her power shielded her for years from any accountability. Still, it was not the building, but the tale attached to it that truly endured. In the decades following Elizabeth's death, her story began to shift, distorted by rumor, inflated by fear, until she stood as a near mythical embodiment of evil. But perhaps the most devastating part of her punishment was not physical, it was the silence. Elizabeth, who had once ruled over an estate with countless servants and wielded the power of life and death without question, was now left with only her own voice and the brief, wordless visits of guards delivering her meals. Her crimes were so monstrous, so unimaginable, that they moved quickly beyond the pages of history and into legend. But despite the uncertainties, one fact remains clear. Elizabeth Bathory was responsible for the torture and murder of dozens, possibly even over 100 young women. Her obsession with eternal youth led her down a path of escalating cruelty, justified in her mind by twisted beliefs about the power of blood. The authorities handled the aftermath with caution. Initially buried in the church at Lactis, her remains were soon removed after local residents objected, saying her presence desecrated sacred ground. On the morning of August 21st, 1614, the guards arrived with her breakfast and found her lifeless in bed. There were no marks on her body, no signs of violence, no evidence of poison. After years of torturing others in a desperate attempt to escape aging and death, Elizabeth Bathory had finally surrendered to the same fate that claims all human beings. Yet her death did not bring closure. If anything, it ignited a legacy that would outlive her by centuries. No marker was placed over her grave, in hopes that it would not become a destination for the morbidly curious. The castle where she had carried out her atrocities was abandoned soon after her death. Locals refused to go near it, claiming that the spirits of her victims still lingered in its shadowed halls. Her body was quietly relocated to the family crypt in Ext. Over the centuries, the castle slowly crumbled into ruin. Some legends claimed she had bathed in the blood of over 650 girls. The real woman, however, was far more complex and perhaps more disturbing. That task is far from easy. Many primary records have been lost, and even contemporary accounts tended to exaggerate the horrors for dramatic effect. To truly understand her, one must look beyond the lurid tales and examine the world in which she lived. What emerges from surviving documents and testimony is the portrait of a woman with severe personality disorders, paranoid, narcissistic, and sadistic, who was enabled at every step by the institutions around her. Elizabeth's complete disregard for human suffering, her obsessive need for dominance, her inflated sense of self-worth, and her pleasure in cruelty all point to psychopathic traits. Traits that were likely intensified by her social standing, but her violence cannot be attributed solely to personal pathology. It was also shaped by her bloodline. Inbreeding was common among European nobility during this period, and the Bathory family had a long documented history of mental illness and violent tendencies. She had access to vulnerable victims, lived in a remote estate that shielded her from scrutiny, and possessed a psychological disposition that took pleasure in pain. These factors combined to form the perfect storm, producing one of the most infamous serial killers in recorded history. Many came from impoverished peasant backgrounds, unprotected and easily exploited by those in power. While Elizabeth's atrocities were extreme, they did not emerge in isolation. They echoed patterns seen before within her own lineage. While fewer in number, the noble-born victims suffered just as deeply. Survivors among the staff carried the scars for life. There are real people whose suffering made the legend possible. Elizabeth Bathory's crimes were not abstract horrors from a distant past. They were intimate, brutal acts of violence committed against individuals who deserved full, meaningful lives. These young women should have had the chance to grow, to love, to build families, and to contribute to their communities. Families mourned daughters who never returned. The social and psychological forces that allowed her to commit such atrocities are far from extinct. The same dangerous combination of unchecked power, isolation, and mental illness that created the Blood Countess continues to manifest in different forms. Entire villages lived in quiet dread. Whether it's political leaders orchestrating genocide, religious authorities exploiting their followers, or wealthy elites preying on the vulnerable, the pattern remains tragically familiar. Power corrupts, and absolute power, the kind Elizabeth held over her household, corrupts absolutely. For generations, the mere mention of the Bathory name was enough to make people cross themselves and whisper prayers for protection. These were daughters sent to the castle by their families, trusting in Elizabeth's noble reputation to ensure their safety. Folklore and superstition were deeply rooted in 17th century life, and Elizabeth's conviction that blood could preserve her youth was not entirely unique. They walked into a nightmare for which there was no return, and the ability to lead seemingly ordinary lives while concealing monstrous behavior. The critical difference is that today's criminals seldom enjoy the institutional protection that shielded Elizabeth for so many years. At the time, the boundaries between science, medicine, and magic were often indistinct. Many people believed in the physical power of rituals. Kata, who was burned with red-hot irons. Pola, who was beaten to death with wooden clubs. Each was a life cut short, not by legend, but by a cruel and calculated hand. Cultural beliefs of the time also played a role. What set Elizabeth apart was not the belief itself, but her ruthless willingness to act on it, regardless of the suffering it caused. Yet, amid all the horror and historical fascination, one essential truth is often forgotten. The victims were real people. They were not faceless characters in a gruesome legend, but young women with lives, dreams, and families who grieved their loss. Most were servant girls between the ages of 14 and 20, drawn to the castle in search of work or training, hoping to support their families or secure a better future. Some of their names still survive in faded court records. Anna, who was torn apart by dogs after enduring torture. These young women were victims of tragic circumstance, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and noticed by a woman whose hunger for cruelty had no limits. Instead, the psychological trauma rippled far beyond the castle walls. Behind every historical monster, though her story may feel like a grim relic of a more barbaric time, the abuse of power is a recurring theme in human history. Modern serial killers often display many of the same psychological markers: the craving for dominance, a deep lack of empathy. The role of complicity in enabling evil is a recurring theme throughout history. Elizabeth could not have carried out her crimes without the active support or silent consent of others. Like in modern atrocities, where systemic cruelty relies on the compliance of many, her terror was made possible by servants who remained quiet, officials who chose to look away, and family members who harbored suspicions but failed to act. In that instant, she made a decision, one that would shape not only her life, but her infamy. She chose to value her own appearance above the lives of countless others. Each played a part in allowing the horror to continue. More than anything, Elizabeth's story reminds us that evil rarely arrives wearing a mask. It doesn't always look monstrous or foreign. The ruins of Countess Castle still stand, though time has claimed much of its former grandeur. The quiet, inner warnings that tell us when we've crossed a line, when ambition becomes obsession, when desire turns to cruelty, when the pursuit of personal happiness comes at the expense of others. Elizabeth Bathory ignored those voices, and the silence that followed was soaked in blood. Tourists visit from time to time, drawn by its grim history, but the locals remain wary. She is not remembered for eternal beauty or unaging grace, but as a grim reminder of what happens when power, isolation, and madness intertwine. And the woman who believed she could defy death has herself been gone for over 400 years. It is a battle that plays out not just in the annals of the past, but within every human soul in every age, in every heart, for as long as we exist. But the questions her story raises about the dangers of unchecked authority, the cost of obsession, and the true worth of a human life still echo loudly in our world. Her legacy is a cautionary tale, a testament to the horrors that arise when vanity is left unchecked, mental illness untreated, and empathy abandoned. They say that on certain nights, when the wind cuts just right through the hills, you can still hear faint cries drifting through the air, echoes of pain that never fully faded. Sometimes it hides behind titles and elegance, thrives in wealth and privilege, and moves undetected through the most refined layers of society. The real danger often lies not in what shocks us, but in what blends in. As we draw this grim tale to a close, it is worth returning to the pivotal moment when Elizabeth first noticed blood on her skin and believed she had discovered the secret to eternal youth. In a world obsessed with youth, where people undergo endless procedures to fight aging, where the beauty industry thrives on our deepest insecurities, and where social media amplifies unrealistic standards, Elizabeth S. motives gone feel as distant as we might hope. The tragic irony of her story is inescapable. In trying to preserve her youth and beauty, she destroyed both. In that way, the madness that consumed Elizabeth Bathory isn't just part of the past. Its seeds still exist, quietly in the world we've built and in the choices we make every day. The woman who murdered to remain untouched by time died abandoned, aged, and disfigured, her name remembered not with admiration, but dread. Yet perhaps the most unsettling aspect of her legacy is what it reflects back at us. We may not bathe in blood, but we live in a culture that often rewards appearance over character, youth over wisdom, and self-interest over compassion. What truly matters is whether we choose to nourish our better instincts or surrender to the darker ones. Yet perhaps the voices we should truly listen for are not those of the dead, but of the living. In the end, the so-called Blood Countess did find a form of immortality, but not the kind she craved. The blood has long dried. The screams have long since faded. Studying figures like Elizabeth Bathory teaches us more than history. It forces us to confront the eternal tension between our noblest instincts and our most dangerous urges.